This podcast is recorded on stolen and unceded Aboriginal land.
We acknowledge the First Nations and elders of this country, and we join their calls for justice.
Serious danger.
Hello, patrons.
That voice.
Love you. Thanks so much for supporting our show. It's time for another episode of this Serious Danger patron podcast about politics, green politics in Australia.
Green Politics in Australia, official Green Play podcast. Supported by Michael Griffin, produced by Michael Griffin, supported by Green Institute. We have the book. He's holding up the book.
Inside the Greens by Paddy Manning, the origins and future of the party, the people and the politics. We're on to chapter 2. We're that far away. We're that far in.
It's so thick.
It's so thick and juicy. There we go. That's the good stuff. Chapter 2, Democrats, blockaders and disarmers. What can you remember of thus far where we got to with Inside the Greens, Emerald? What have you learned from my wonderful lecture series?
The story about the woman that got murdered for being an activist. The story about Lee, Rhiannon, Nee Brown and Bob Brown being at the same place at the same time, except Lee Rhiannon was this cool young communist.
Mm-hmm. Bob Brown was not.
Bob Brown was not. Yeah. Those are my standouts.
The big takeaway. Fantastic. Yeah. If you haven't listened to the other episodes, we've done the prologue and chapter 1. We're now moving into chapter 2. As the title suggests, we're looking at the rise of the Australian Democrats and their relationship to the Greens, the Franklin blockade campaign and Bob Brown's early political career and him actually ending up in Tasmanian Parliament, and the rise of the anti-nuclear movement and the establishment of the Greens in Sydney.
Wow.
There is some really good stuff there. I will say some of this content sort of crosses over with the Bob Brown documentary, Giants, about him being a tree.
We also have a Patreon episode on. Very good. Love that movie. He's like a tree, guys.
He is a tree. Bob Brown is a tree. Before we go in, what do you think about the Democrats? I feel like the Democrats have come up once or twice. There is like quite a relationship and there is shared history between that particular political party and the Greens. What are your general vibes on the Oz Dems?
Oh, I think that they had their time. I'm sure they were fine at the time, but like who cares now, really? I remember maybe I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but two of my best friends in primary school, Tanton and Holly, who were twins, their mum was a Democrat in some capacity, maybe even a candidate. And so they would be on the booths like handing out Democrat how to votes and stuff.
It's so 90s. I remember Natasha Stott-Despoja being like, quite a cool lady, but also she was just in the media a lot, and she's a very, very nice looking lady, very attractive lady. She was on the Glass House, and she was quite funny on there. I thought she was pretty good. Mm-hmm. And then also my abiding memory is them being sellouts when it comes to the GST.
Yes, that's, I think, the legacy that everyone remembers.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, it's sort of interesting, the roots of this, the appearance of the Democrats and the relationship, I suppose, between that and what we consider the Greens. And I guess, whatever you think about the Democrats' politics or their lack of being cool left-wing people, they, I guess, proved to a degree that you could be a minority party and have some influence and you could sort of cut through in that way. Yeah.
And, I mean, their little slogan, keep the bastards honest, it's still hanging around.
It's pretty good stuff.
Still recognisable.
We'll come to that in this very chapter.
Okay.
So we finished chapter 1. Bob Brown was running for the United Tasmania Group, the UTG, in 1975 in the Senate and did very, very badly. But he put his hand up for it, got very few votes, and that was sort of where chapter 1 wrapped up. We opened chapter 2 in 1975. Malcolm Fraser's just won the election. Little tidbit here that I thought was very interesting. Malcolm Fraser became more moderate after politics, and he's now almost disowned by the Liberal Party. It's often forgotten how conservative the Fraser government was. Invited to dinner with US President Gerald Ford in 1976 and given the customary opportunity to pick any American as a dinner companion, Fraser chose the libertarian novelist Ayn Rand, cult author of The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, and the arch-capitalist pseudo-philosopher beloved by almost all today's neoliberals.
Wow.
First of all, I didn't know that was a thing. If you go to the White House, you can choose any
American. And then they're like dragged there, like handcuffed.
You've been summoned by the Australian Prime Minister, yeah.
That's so weird.
Now, I was going to ask you who you would choose, but I'm pretty sure I know.
I think you know too.
Little Tay-Tay.
Yeah, probably. I don't know. I'm actually there would be someone better. I don't think I would actually choose Taylor Swift, but she's the first one that comes to mind.
It's exactly who you'd fucking choose.
Maybe her dumb new football boyfriend who says funny dumb things. That would be fun. Yeah.
That'd be fun. Oh my God, I did see a tweet take about how, because he's had such brain injury, that CTE or whatever, like someone seriously tried to raise concerns about the mental gap between
I
Taylor
don't
Swift
think
and
that was
this
real,
guy.
Tom. I think that was a bit.
Was that a joke?
Yeah.
Well, the satire should be clearer because some of us don't understand
people
it.
like you. Have you had some head injuries as well?
Okay, so Fraser gets elected. Don Chipp is a Liberal who gets dumped from the front bench once Fraser wins the 1975 election. And pretty soon he says, fuck this noise, and he quits the Liberal Party and he becomes a crossbencher, and he proceeds to set up the new centreline party, the Australian Democrats. Okay. Basically, they're a new centreline party. They're about compassion. They want a little less of the law of the jungle. You know, Malcolm Fraser's famous quote, life was never meant to be easy. This kind of, fuck social welfare. The Razor Gang hacking away at the social welfare state, thanks to his wonderful treasurer, John Howard, saying, no, none of that. We like direct democracy. We're anti-nuclear, not a huge amount of environmental policies in the original Democrats, but certainly, yes, against nuclear weapons and energy too. So he sets up the Democrats and they sort of start siphoning in other existing parties that all sort of come together. So they combine with the New Liberal movement, which came out of South Australia, and the Australia Party, who we met in an earlier chapter as one of the other sort of forerunners, which was a party that seemed to have some pretty cool policies, certainly things that would speak to Greens voters today.
Yeah.
But basically the Australian Party is formed and sort of, there's a big legacy, a sharing of legacy between the Australia Party and the original Democrats.
Okay.
The Australia Party did very, very badly, and I thought this was funny. In 1973, flushed with success, Gordon Barton, he was the founder of the Australia Party, had seriously predicted that the Australia Party could form government in Canberra in a decade. But in a devastating result in 1974, proved the beginning of the end.
Aw, it's like Clive Palmer, Craig Kelly, the new Prime Minister.
Well, this is what I was saying. It's like we talk about candidate fever, where if you're a candidate, you're getting towards election day, you think, oh, I'm going to win. But there's this other form of candidate fever where it's like you're a minor party and you think, yes, we're going to form government.
It's just
tomorrow,
election fever. Like people
huge.
get election fever. Yeah, campaign fever.
Yeah.
It's just insanity.
So they just had a terrible result in 1974, and then Barton sort of comes up with these ideas, these things that the Australia Party should do to reevaluate, to have a new strategy, and outlined 4 ways forward which resonate today. First, the party should aim to be pioneering and adopt a radical and distinctive mix of policies, regardless of whether they were likely to be taken up by the major parties. Second, it should be reformist, influencing the major parties to adopt more centrist policies through preferences. This was pretty much a strategy until now. Third, it should be a mass party that aimed for government. And here McPherson threw down the gauntlet. If getting in and governing directly is the course of action we choose, then the Australia Party would have to consciously appeal to the economic interests of a large group in the community.
Yep.
Correct? This particular challenge, arguably, was never met by the Australia Party or the Democrats, nor yet the Greens. This is according to Paddy Manning, which you could argue is true and part of the battle now to try and be better at that and to speak to the economic interests of the people.
Yeah.
Fourth, it should be subversive. If the Australia Party could not beat the major parties in the ballot box, it could at least infiltrate them. And then Paddy Manning writes, none of this happened, of course.
It was nice thoughts, though. Someone was thinking about it.
They laid out the strategy.
Yeah.
None of that happened. Yep. But so the Australia Party gets formed with the Democrats. They have much more radical environmental policies, and that sort of starts to form and flesh out the Democrats and their approach to environmentalism and conservation as well. Also, a number of the figures around the Australia Party would eventually go on to become sort of leader figures in the Greens movement and setting up the Greens Party as well. There's also a bit here on Don Chipp's vision for what the Democrats should be. The UTG fizzled out. By the way, they sort of went away. But some people in Tasmania were certainly getting involved in the Democrats. The Democrats went from strength to strength. Chipp, who never imagined the Democrats would form government, outlined a very clear strategy at the launch of the 1977 election campaign. Our first objective is to secure a Senate seat in every state. This will give us the balance of power, the balance of common sense, the balance of reason in the Senate. Our role will be to restore the Senate to its proper function as a house of review and a state's house, not a party political house.
They were so 70s that they wrote balance of power and then they were like, oh, power. Is that bad? Oh,
Is that bad? I don't know
reason.
about power.
Yeah.
I mean, are the Democrats the original teals? Is that sort of a fair...
It seems very tealy, doesn't it? But it seems a little, but it's like, it's not as, it is like, it's 70s versions of teals that it's like a little bit more radical, kind of, but not really. I don't know.
Disaffected liberals,
Yeah.
thinking that we need a new version of politics. And actually, in this next paragraph will speak to this too. A few years later, he would crystallize the party's raison d'etre in an unforgettable line. The Democrats were there to keep the bastards honest. It was a strategy that resonated with the electorate immediately. Chip from Victoria and Colin Mason from New South Wales were elected in the party's first outing with 16% and 8% of the primary vote in their respective states. Nationally, the Democrats polled over 9% in the lower house, contesting 109 of 124 seats and 11% in the Senate. It was a stunning debut.
But that's what makes me think, like, keeping the bastards honest, the Teals would never use that because they're all about civility politics. They're not like an anti-political party, right?
Right, which is, was what I was going to ask you. I mean, keeping the bastards honest is an anti-politics sentiment, right? Like that is an early precursor to clearly tapping into the disaffection and the anger that the public have with the current state of politicians and the normal people who are there, and a classic, like, we're on your side. We think these people are bastards too.
Yeah.
We're going to try and do our best to keep them vaguely honest.
Yeah.
And I guess, I'd say that the Teals somewhat tap into that, but their solution is, an anti-corruption body, for example.
Yeah.
These kind of institutions that we have
it's
now
like
and has solved corruption.
Keeping the bastards honest versus holding them to account that are like similar sentiments or similar things that you're trying to get at, but like different vibes.
But these are, still very liberal ideas, still very overwhelming faith in the institutions as they're currently constituted, no critique of capitalism, and as we'll see, those tensions certainly come out as the Democrats keep going, and certainly why some people were more attracted to the Democrats than, say, the Greens was on issues of economic justice, I think. The next section, again, covering some similar ground to what we see in Giants, but we're also looking at Bob Brown and his burgeoning political career, and I thought this opening paragraph is very interesting. Bob Brown had not shed many tears at the fall of the Whitlam government, which he blamed at least partly for the loss of the Lake Pedder, although he later acknowledged that Labor's accession to the World Heritage Convention in 1974 was critical to saving the Franklin River, and which had given tacit approval for Indonesia's invasion of East Timor, the former Portuguese colony leaning towards communism. We don't talk about that enough, that the Whitlam was on board with that. Very dodgy thing that Whitlam did. Now 31, however, Brown found that his politics were shifting. His parents had voted Liberal and he'd grown up admiring Menzies and was an anti-communist. His first vote had been for the Country Party, and at one point he'd backed the New England New State movement, which wanted to secede from New South Wales.
Wow, okay.
It's Barnaby Joyce country. They wanted to set up their own, their own state, a new state.
There you go. All right.
As a young medical student, Brown intended to stand for the Liberals and twice went along to the party's branch headquarters in Sydney and Canberra to join up. The first time, the office was shut. The next time, it was just before 5 p.m. and he was asked to come back later, but he never did.
Wow, you could have had him, guys. Could have had him.
Could have been a hero. A few years later, Brown turned out to cheer LBJ in 1966. He had not voted for Whitlam in 1972, scrawling "Save Lake Pedder" across his ballot paper in protest.
Of course.
Nevertheless, a political awakening was gradually occurring. In the broadest terms, he was on a long journey from conservative to progressive.
Interesting.
They talk about, like, a big moment was his first ever protest was in 1974. He was in the United States. He joined protesters at the University of Chicago who were demonstrating against Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who had backed a military coup in Greece and was speaking on campus. He'd never protested before until that moment.
Wow.
All kinds of radical left-wing groups were rallying and there were CIA types taking photos. But in a foreign country, he found he didn't care. He was just like, no one knows me here. I'm going to get involved.
Seems unwise. But yeah, fucking, radical, bloody, lefty, brainwashing university campuses. That's what they do.
Brown identified with the protesters. They felt the same as me about the 19 students who had been smashed to death in Athens. That was my first involvement really in political protest, and I came away feeling in some way like I'd done a good thing. That was a breakthrough of sorts. Good on you, Bob.
Yeah.
Marxist poisoning continues. Yeah. We then talk about his coming out, which we discussed in the documentary when he had to go on TV. His first hurdle, if he wanted to get involved as a UTG candidate and be sort of open and politically campaigning, was to be honest about who he was. He goes on This Day Tonight program on the ABC and comes out officially. He says, like, hey, look at me. I'm a nice, non-threatening doctor and I'm gay, even though that's a crime in Tasmania at the time. Everything's totally fine, which I still have a lot of respect for.
Yeah.
Although some of the things he said in that interview were not ideal. Understandable, perhaps, but not ideal.
Like?
Politicians should look fairly at the law and remove discrimination on the grounds of sexuality from the statutes, Brown told the media. How can homosexuality between consenting adults be a crime when there is no victim? It was a gutsy step, given homosexuality was still a criminal offence in the state. Brown's words were chosen to placate rather than offend. I believe that being born homosexual is an unfortunate disadvantage for anyone. The fact that I am a homosexual gives me no feeling of pride.
Oh, that's sad. That's not.
Isn't that fucking sad? Yes, I know. It's sad that he felt he had to say that, but yes. I'm sure he's come a long way since then and loves himself. Being a filthy homosexual. So he then sets up the Tasmanian Wilderness Society. That's going to play a big role in the Greens down the track. He then starts protesting a lot more. He's got a taste of it. He loves a little sweet protest.
Can't stop. Once
Can't
you pop,
get enough.
Can't stop.
He had that protest when the Enterprise, the US warship, was coming into Tasmania. He sets up a protest in a tent, goes on sort of a hunger strike and camps out on Kunyanyi, Mount Wellington for 6 days, I believe. People were calling him a commie. They were throwing bottles at him. It was really bad. Pretty amazing that one of the sailors, the US sailors, was sympathetic. One African-American soldier told him, when we practice a scramble to get the planes up off the ship within minutes of the start of war with Russia, I think about the day it will be for real, and I know I'll never see my wife and kids in Chicago again. I support what you're doing.
Yeah.
I don't think we can really, I mean, obviously there are talks of nuclear war still today, but like this moment, I guess, when it was a reality post-World War II in the 70s when it really did feel like it was all about to kick off. It's very hard to imagine.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
While he's doing that protest, he's interviewed by this guy, Dr. Norman Sanders, for This Day Tonight, who's an American professor in geomorphology. He became a journalist, moves to Tasmania, and interviews Bob, is impressed by him, and eventually starts getting involved a lot more in the Wilderness Society. And he'd later play a key role in the Democrats in Tasmania and Bob Brown's political career.
Mm-hmm.
Bob Brown takes over from Sanders as the full-time director of the Tasmanian Wilderness Society in 1978, and that's pretty much him going, I'm not a doctor anymore, I'm a full-time conservationist environmental activist. In the 1979 state election, Norm Sanders stands in Denison for the Australian Democrats. They try to get him to run for the UTG, but he said, no, no good, probably a little bit too radical, I suppose, for his likes, even though the UTG was not very radical at all. But he's like, the Democrats are good, and by this point, the Democrats have a pretty impressive environmental platform, as Sanders sees it. So he's like, I'm on board. He runs to Denison in the state election. He just misses out. Then there's a big scandal about one of the parties misusing funds, and so they have a by-election. He stands again, and he then wins. And according to Paddy Manning, at least, that makes him the first out-and-out environmentalist elected to any parliament in Australia.
Okay. All right.
And he seems like as much as, yes, he's a bit more conservative than you are, he still seems a little bit cool. The state's tiny political establishment was in shock. Suddenly they were being lectured by a tough, bearded greenie who turned up to Parliament on a BMW motorcycle and knew his engineering besides.
Okay.
Sanders needled the Labor government on the potential of wind power, which the hydro had studiously ignored, despite wind being Tasmania's world-beating resource, even going so far as to reject federal grants for research.
Wow. Yeah. They're just like, nah.
Do you remember the evil hydro, the biggest employer in the state, government department, who just, I guess, hated the environment and hated all these fucking greenies and wanted to do anything they could to stop any kind of protest because they just wanted to dam every single inch of Tasmanian wilderness.
Of course.
Of course. Well, they're the same ones who want to dam the Franklin River. The next section looks at this. And again, we talk about the blockade, which we've touched on before in previous episodes. But a few interesting wrinkles here. In 1981, the Labor Premier, Doug Lowe, so you got Labor government in 1981. Doug Lowe is the Premier. He's against the dam. He then succumbs to public pressure, and they eventually come up with this compromise that he thinks should be put to the people. Okay. To break the deadlock, Lowe decided to put 3 options to the people. The Gordon below Franklin. So this is a plan saying
Yeah.
there was a compromise. So the Gordon above Olga would mean that the Franklin River would be saved, but you'd still be damming further upstream, I believe.
Okay.
Or further downstream, I should say. To break the deadlock, Lowe decided to put 3 options to the people. The Gordon below Franklin, the Gordon above Olga, and a no dams option, which Lowe had promised to Bob Brown. Tasmanian Labor fatally undermined Lowe, forcing him to pull the no dams option. And Lowe promptly resigned as Premier and sat with Sanders on the crossbench.
Okay. Interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah. Okay.
I don't know enough about Doug Lowe to say whether he's a hero of the movement, but that's pretty incredible. But again, just classic Labor. We can't have democracy. We can't put this option to the people because what if they choose the thing that we don't want them to choose? No.
Yeah, we wouldn't want that. That's remarkable. Though. Imagine a sitting premier today resigning and sitting on the crossbench.
Yes, as a point of principle because he was fucked over by his own party. I mean, I have no idea what's happening in Tasmania at the moment. In recent months, it seems like no one's in power and people are resigning all over the place and
oh, really? Haven't been paying attention to what's going on down there.
Yeah, it's pretty nuts. Because it's so small, that parliament, things can change pretty wildly, pretty quickly.
Okay.
And I believe a member of the Liberal government went to sit on a crossbench, potentially jeopardising them and, all that kind of good stuff. He goes to the crossbench. Another Labor MP resigns and sits with them too. And so they're on the crossbench with Norman Sanders. The 3 crossbenchers held the balance of power in the lower house, although, as Sanders recalled later, you can only have a balance of power if there's any difference between the parties.
Yeah.
Which I think which is a pretty fucking great line and certainly speaks to the Greens experience.
Mm-hmm.
Got a new Labor Premier, Harry Holgate, he takes over. They put this referendum to the people without the no dams option. And the Wilderness Society basically organised a campaign saying, what should we do about this? And they encourage people to write no dams on their ballot papers, right? Saying, fuck this thing, take on the whole process, point out how, hollow and dodgy it is anyway. Write no dams. That is what happened. The write-in was a stunning success. Precisely 33% of voters wrote down no dams.
That's amazing. That's incredible.
The final informal vote was 35.5%, apparently the highest informal vote in any referendum in the world. Wow. And then you had similar campaigns happening across the country. Again, this stuff was getting national attention. People generally cared about the Franklin River and the dams and stuff. So there was a by-election in the federal seat of Lowe in Sydney's inner west. No dams polled 9%. 25% of voters in the ACT House of Assembly election wrote no dams. And in late 1982, 41% of voters wrote no dams in a by-election for the well-off semi-rural Melbourne seat of Flinders. Okay, so that's Liberal heartland again.
What the
41%.
Holy shit.
People really hate dams. So eventually Premier Holgate loses the confidence of the Parliament, and so they have to have another election to replace the Tasmanian state government. During that campaign, Bob Brown runs. All the environmentalists in Tasmania think, we're going to win heaps of seats because with the success of this no dams thing. That's not actually how it worked out. Norm Sanders won again in Denison. Bob Brown stood, but he was unsuccessful. Bob Brown believes that in part was because he'd come out openly as gay. He was the target of a nasty smear campaign by the company-backed Hydro Employees Action Team, or HEAT, which mass-printed the 1976 Examiner article in which he'd come out with accompanying scrawls and dropped into letterboxes all over Denison. So my understanding is the Hydro Employees Action Team, that is employees of the government department, the Hydro, who has already done all this evil shit.
Yeah, what?
I guess it's kind of like a union, but it's backed by the company itself.
By the boss, okay.
Who are then putting out homophobic election materials during a campaign to say, don't vote for this guy, he's a
gay.
poofter.
What the fuck? Okay.
Wild stuff. The Labor lose that election. Okay, they're decimated, and the Liberal Party wins, even though the Liberal Party sort of backs the dams as well, sort of weirdly. So I guess
so weird.
A bunch of other reasons. Liberals get back in, and they're going to be pro the dams. And the Upper House President Harry Braid said, "No power on earth will stop the dam now." At this moment, the campaign to save the Franklin are trying to find other parts along the Franklin to capture people's imagination, to show how beautiful this part of the world is and to say and important it is. He goes on a trip. One of these guys, along with Bob Brown, go on a trip down the river, and they find a cave with ancient Aboriginal remains. Carbon dating shortly afterwards showed the remains to be at least 20,000 years old.
Wow.
The cave would prove to be the most southern occupation of the Earth during the last ice age.
Wow.
Kiernan, one of the activists, named it Fraser Cave, hoping to attract the attention of the Prime Minister. This is an old trick of Milo Dunphy's, who had named Fife Cave in the Coolong Wilderness after the then Mines Minister, Wal Fife, but it was soon renamed Kudakina.
Yeah.
Ridiculously, the hydro proposed to continue the flooding, but to cover the cave in concrete to preserve the remains.
My God. My God. Okay. Wow. Fucking cowboy shit.
Should also say that guy Kiernan later said, like, oh, I shouldn't have named it Fraser Cave. We should have reached out to the First Nations people. We really fucked up there, and we alienated a lot of the Aboriginal community to our cause by just giving it our white conservative Prime Minister a name where we found the remains of Aboriginal people. So then we get into the early 80s. By this point, the campaign to save the Franklin is really garnering traction. Malcolm Fraser is against the Franklin Dam going ahead. He offers $500 million to the Liberal state government to not do it.
$500 million. That's
$500 million. I assume in today's money or then, but a lot of money basically. And the Labor government eventually, changed the Labor Party rather in opposition in 1982 changed their platform to say that if we win government, we will save the Franklin Dam. The Democrats also very involved in the campaign to save the Franklin. Again, whatever you think of the Democrats, they did play a key role in that big campaign to try and save the Franklin, and they did campaign on it and contributed to the blockade.
Yeah.
They launched the blockade of the Franklin River to stop the dam in 1982. The precedent they cite is Terania Creek, and I was wondering whether this rings a bell to you at all.
Yeah.
From northern New South Wales.
Rivers.
You know that part?
Yeah, pretty sure Terania Creek, yeah.
So it seems like there was a big blockade there, the first ever blockade. The Forestry Commission had announced plans to log one of the last remnants of old-growth rainforest in Terania Creek. Am I pronouncing that right?
I say Terania. I'm pretty sure it's Terania. Yeah.
And so it's near Nimbin, and so you got a whole lot of environmentally conscious hippies who did some pretty amazing stuff. They went down, this is chaining themselves to trees, doing ecotage, that is spiking trees, hammering spikes into the trees so that they can't be chainsawed safely. I'd never heard of this before, right? So you put big chunks of metal in there so they can't actually cut them down. And that's a version of ecotage, for example.
That's what? Ecological sabotage.
Sabotage,
right?
I guess.
Okay.
Yes.
Cool. Portmanteau.
An inquiry was called and ultimately a moratorium declared on logging there. It was the first example of a successful blockade, a tactic that would become to green politics what the strike was to the Labor movement.
And the hippies are still bloody here. And now I am too.
In their little drum circles, all of them called Emerald Moon. Yes.
That's right.
So yes, very successful campaign. That's the sort of precedent. They're saying, hey, we should do the same thing. We should totally have a blockade. Although some members in the Tasmanian Wilderness Society were skeptical about whether we should do a blockade. Norm Sanders was like, oh, then it'll become about law and order. That's an argument that we're going to lose as lefties. Again, a little bit of a civility politics kind of stuff.
Yeah.
He also wasn't a fan of the influence of the Quakers were having on the Tasmanian Wilderness Society. They insist on consensus and preach nonviolent direct action. And Sanders wasn't really into that.
Okay.
He wasn't a pacifist. He'd served in the US Air Force and believed standing up to bullies. Once, Sanders and fellow Army veteran Peter Cundall, later host of Gardening Australia, hero here at Serious Danger, fought back against hostile locals in Strawn who would occasionally intimidate or even beat up greenies. So they weren't prepared to. They were prepared to, throw a few punches, I guess, in defense of the environment. But the blockade does go ahead, of course, and lots of people from across the country come to join the blockade, and there does seem to be a bit of a tension between the slightly more conservative, perhaps tree Tory-esque figures involved in the Tasmanian Wilderness Society and these sort of more anarchic hippies who are coming down with their dreadlocks.
Quote unquote, professional activists.
Yes.
Or career activists. Yeah. As always. Yeah.
The classic. One of the characters, David Rainbow.
Fuck off.
Who someone suggests a TWS campaigner described as naked except for a loincloth, jungle green face paint with a rainbow across his chest.
Oh,
it reminded me of Lord of the Flies.
Oh, God. So embarrassing.
Quite a bit of tension. When Bob Hawke's Labor Party won the election in 1983, the Tasmanian Wilderness Society was like, oh, the blockade should end. Like we should, because they've been one and they said they were going to save the river. Some of these other more...
I would suggest you don't do that.
Yes, the other campaigners were like, no, the hydro are here. They're already doing as much damage as possible. We should stay strong until it's absolutely clear that that should not be the case. So, yes, quite a bit of tension there between the more radical direct action folks and the more conservative suit-wearing TWS.
Yeah.
But as we've discussed before, incredible campaign. In the end, 2,613 people registered with the TWS at Strawn for the blockade. There were 1,200 arrests and 1,300 charges laid, but only 40-odd convictions. A clutch of later Greens politicians were there: Bob Brown, Christine Milne, Ian Cohen, Janet Rice, Penny Wright, Murray Matson, and others. Milne was relaxed about going to jail. To a former boarder at a Catholic girls' school, the thud of a door shutting for the night, locking her in, was very familiar.
What? Is this what Paddy Manning is saying? That's such a funny thing to say.
That's his little angle. I guess she might have said something to that effect.
Maybe she said something like that. That's funny.
And he also talks about just how much Bob Brown's, campaigning, and he was the face of the campaign, how celebrated he was for that, and he's constantly appearing in documentaries and trying to show the Australian people how beautiful the Franklin River is. And I didn't know this. He was arrested and jailed on the 16th of December 1982 and was named Australian of the Year by The Australian on the 1st of January 1983.
The newspaper.
The newspaper.
Wow.
Rupert Murdoch endorsed. Now, around about that same time, Norm Sanders resigned his seat in the Tasmanian House of Assembly. He'd returned from this is pretty awesome. He'd returned from the blockade for a short sitting, and this is a quote now from Sanders, and the parliamentarians were mostly in the evening session. They were drunk and saying, bloody greenies, bloody greenings. And I'd just been to dinner with these people who had just come out of jail for their beliefs. And I looked at all of my colleagues in that parliament and I said, I cannot sit in the same place with these people.
You disgust me.
You disgust me. So I resigned right there and then. I got up and said, I resign. Everybody said, you can't. I said, I'm doing it. And the next day I got on my motorcycle and rode out to Government House and handed in my resignation, which freed me up for the next blockade.
There you go. All right.
And because he did that, Bob Brown won on the countback system under the Hare Clark, and so he gets elected. So he goes from prison to parliament in the one day.
One day?
In one day. I guess he was going to be released from prison in the morning and then eventually becomes the new member for Denison that very night.
Just like Trump. It can be done. It can be done.
It can be done. Lock them up. Of course, the Franklin campaign wasn't won with the federal election. Eventually, it would have to come later in that year with the High Court case. A bare majority, 4-3 decision of the High Court, in which the High Court said, yes, the federal government can intervene and stop a dam like this going ahead under its international treaties power. That is, that Franklin was internationally significant, and so the Commonwealth could step in and stop something like this.
We did it.
Yay! All right, I'd suggest we could maybe do one last little section from this chapter and then we'll pick it up next time we do the show. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
All right, I'll tell you one last thing about this chapter and then we might pick things up in the future because there's some interesting stuff about the anti-nuclear movement, how that plays into it. I don't think we've got time for that for this particular episode, but I do think you'll be interested in this particular nugget of information.
Go on.
There's a slight detour to talk about the success of the German Greens around the same time.
The German Greens?
The Grünen. Yeah.
Oh, the Grünen?
Do you know much about the German Greens? Strong feelings? Have they come across your desk?
Well, I don't in my capacity as a Green. I do in my capacity as having a racist, like hyper-conservative, very conspiracy-pilled stepmother who is German.
Oh, I see.
Who often likes to rant about Die Grünen, the German Greens, and, vaccines and how they're bad and they don't actually protect the environment. I don't know what else they're doing, but yeah.
Gosh, that is interesting. And what would be her politics? She'd be more...
I just told you.
Yes, but like who would she vote for?
I wouldn't be surprised if she doesn't vote at all.
Okay.
Or, she'd probably these days she might vote for, whoever's anti-vax, probably Pauline Hanson, whoever's going to stop Muslim immigration. She's,
She loves freedom then, I guess.
She loves freedom. She loves freedom.
Well, in 1983, there's the federal election in Australia. There's also an election in Germany. And the German Greens, the Grünen, they win 28 seats in the 528-seat Bundestag.
528?
Yes.
Why is it so big? That's ridiculous.
That's a
How do
lot
they get
of
anything done?
That really is a lot of seats. They have
My
heaps more people
God.
than us, I guess. Yeah.
Fucking hell. But give it a rest. What's everyone get their own personal MP? Like,
They've got heaps more. What is the population?
how many people live in Germany?
83 million today. Anyway.
Okay, so 4 times. I guess that is not that much more than 4 times what we've got, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. I guess.
A lot of Germans out there. Shout out to all our German listeners.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a big jump, and it's certainly come out of the more of the peace movement rather than the environmental movement, I suppose. As a quote here, after all, the Germans did not have pristine wilderness to defend, but they did have acid rain, runaway pollution, and nuclear reactors to fight against.
Mm-hmm.
But it was not clear-cut. The Grünen had different strands from the beginning, and holding right and left together was not easy. Here we get into the history of the 4 pillars, which we've discussed before on the show too.
Mm.
A key conference at Offenbach in October 1979 produced the famous 4 pillars, which have formed the basis of green politics around the world ever since.
Mm.
According to former UK Greens leader and author Sarah Parkin, most of the Assembly wanted the new party to represent other possibilities to either socialism or capitalism, but the left-oriented delegates insisted on socialism and were reluctant about adopting non-violence as a fundamental principle.
Mm.
Okay, now we're going to hear more about the 4 pillars in a second, but according to one of the party's founders, August Hausleiter, reportedly a former Nazi. Now,
Sorry?
yes, apparently this is kind of a thing. Apparently quite a number of the founding members and people who are actively involved in the German Greens have a few links to the old
Makes
Nazis.
a lot of sense.
Maybe your stepmom's onto something.
No, I think she probably agrees with the Nazis.
Oh, okay. Oh, right.
No,
well,
I
she
don't
should
know.
be happy. She should
No,
like the
maybe
Greens
she's
then.
yeah. Who knows? She just hates Arabs, so maybe she. Anyway.
Oh, God.
Wow.
This is from August
Whoopsie.
Hausleiter's Wikipedia. Relatively little is known for certain about Hausleiter's life before 1945.
Ooh, never good. Never good.
Much of what is known comes from what Hausleiter himself wrote or from party publications emanating from the Deutsche Germanschaft, the right-wing political movement with which he was associated in the 1950s. And not all of this can be agreed to with more than neutral sources. Hausleiter himself also managed to disseminate differing versions of his past.
Oh, Nazi.
There was also a piece in the Jerusalem Post about what they're arguing is the Nazi roots of this party. Now, this was an article written in response to the German Greens trying to endorse a BDS motion. So, let's take the massive grain of salt that we're getting from the Jerusalem Post when it comes to the German Greens' current politics and their history. But according to the Jerusalem Post, Werner Vogel, a former member of the Nazi Party and of its SA stormtroopers, was among the first elected members of the Greens to the Bundestag in 1983.
Oh, wow.
They also claim that August Hausleiter was active in Hitler's Munich beer hall putsch in 1923 and praised the German Wehrmacht in 1942. He stoked anti-American, which is fine, and anti-Semitic sentiments, which are not, in post-World War II West Germany as well.
So, like, this party is just very much like deep green. We're just all about the environment, but that they also have the 4 pillars. But is social justice not one of the 4 pillars? Like, they don't believe in anti-racism. I'm kind of confused.
Well, this is pretty crazy in terms of how the 4 pillars, where they come from. Okay, and this is according to August Hausleiter,
himself,
accused Nazi. Okay.
Yes. Okay.
Reportedly.
Right.
There were 3,000 people screaming their own positions in the convention hall. This is at the big conference in Offenbach in 1979. This person kept saying, "Don't give up, don't give up, they're getting tired." Although agreement seemed impossible, I, the reported Nazi, took a piece of paper and wrote 4 words on it: ecology, social responsibility, grassroots democracy, and non-violence.
4 words in German, I see. I'm like, that's not 4 words. That's probably all 4 of them would be 1 word in German. Why don't they just do 1?
Look, he's a bloody Nazi. You're a bloody grammar Nazi. Look at you.
Wow, so true. Go on.
Then I called the leaders of the left and the right into the room where the journalists were and said, "Sign." We then went back into the convention hall and announced we have a program.
Hang on, sorry. So I was so distracted. Okay, Ecology, social responsibility, you said?
Yes. Grassroots democracy and nonviolence.
Ah, okay. Social responsibility. It's kind of different to
is
social
that?
justice,
Social justice?
isn't it?
Is it? What are our actual 4 pillars now again? Remind
Now,
me.
well, they have like the wording has changed a little bit. Now it's ecological wisdom.
Yes.
I believe it's social justice, which is meant to incorporate economic justice.
Yes.
There's grassroots participatory democracy,
Yes.
and there's peace and nonviolence.
Right.
Pretty sure.
All Nazi principles.
All Nazi principles, which we got from the Nazi who wrote them on a bit of paper. Damn, that's wild.
Isn't that fucking crazy?
It's actually okay not to support the pillars now.
Yes, I guess so. Very funny when, hey, respect the 4th pillar of nonviolence. You know who came up with that?
Wow. And the Greens, so do you know much about the German Greens though now? Like they're not very good, are they? Aren't they the ones that are quite bad?
Everything I hear is them, yes. I mean, they either were in government now or they have been recently.
Yeah.
And yes, I everything I hear is from other people saying that they're sellouts. I mean, when people say, why can't the Australian Greens be more like the German Greens? The implication is, why can't they give up on what they believe in? I believe they're quite in favour of nuclear power these days as well, which is also what people say that Australian Greens should be like. Now, look, I'm really speaking out of my range here. I'm sure there are people listening to this who probably know more about the German Greens, and I'm sure that Australian Greens people have good connections. And actually the rest of this little section is about, Petra Kelly, who was the leader, comes to Australia and gives a National Press Club address. And there's clearly a lot of inspiration and collaboration between the German Greens movement and the early days of the Australian Greens.
Stuff.
Non-Nazi stuff. Nazis do not get a look in. Very much anti-Nazi. Bad.
Okay.
I also don't know enough about German domestic politics to talk about the presence of people who had connections to Nazism and how often they were around, and like I would be amazed that there aren't other political parties with some members that played a role in their founding that have some links to the Nazi party.
I guess if you're someone who likes to have a go, who likes to get involved with whatever's around,
engaged.
They're engaged. I'm letting the bit go. I don't know.
We always need volunteers, that's that's pretty important.
Doers.
Anyway, last piece on that. De Groonen are getting traction in the 1980s as Thatcherism and Reaganism are taking off. Kelly comes to Australia in 1984 to talk to the National Press Club. Talks about how Australia has a huge role in the anti-nuclear movement because we're, talks of digging up uranium and exporting it, and we have all these US military bases. She's like, come on, Australia, get it together and sort of stop that.
Yeah.
And the German Greens are sort of trailblazing. They're doing a lot of stuff, but then, of course, the inevitable split occurs, and particularly over Germany's position in NATO and other questions of foreign affairs. Barely a year after entering the Bundestag, the split between de Groenen's pragmatic wing, the realists or realos, and the ideological wing, the fundamentalists or fundies, was already opening up fast. Kelly, the leader, dubbed the Peace Angel, did not take sides and worked to bridge the divide. She was perhaps the only one who could. Yeah, a lot of splits going on all over on the left. All right, we'll save the rest of that chapter for next time.
Is it
Inside
bedtime?
the Green Story Time.
Bedtime
I think it's
now.
time to go to bed. We've all done very well. We've learned about Nazis and Bob Brown being gay and a cave.
You learn something new every day, hey?
We've covered a lot there.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening. Any questions?
Well, how many pages are we into the book?
That's 49.
What?
49 pages, yeah.
I really do, I have to say, like, how long did it take Paddy Manning to write this? It's so dense.
478 pages all up. And
Goodness me. So we're a 10th-ish the way
Yeah, we're doing
through.
well.
Wow. All right. Well, I guess we've got to do another 100 episodes of the podcast so that we can get through Inside the Greens by Paddy Manning.
Thanks for listening. Thanks for supporting the show, patrons. We love you very much. Anything you do to share the show would be much obliged. If you give us a 5-star review, tell your friends and family, and let them know there's this cool podcast where they read a book to you very slowly.
Yeah. You get a sticker and put it in visible places, and people will go, that is such a funny sticker. What's that URL down the bottom? That's crazy. SeriousDangerPod.com. oh my goodness, who are these guys? Do they do a podcast or something? Click, listen. Whoa, this is so funny. This is so crazy. I'm going to tell someone else. I'm going to order a sticker. You know, butterfly effect, movement grows, Greens win government in 16 years or however long we've got left. So, you know.
Wow, I just started listening to my stepdaughter's podcast. And I think it's really cool. Actually, I think the vaccines are okay.
More evil.
And I'm a leftist now.
I'm a leftist now. Yes. Wow. Yeah, maybe that's right. That's the end goal. My stepmother stops being evil. Awesome. All right.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen?
Serious danger to Australia.